Dear friends, welcome back to our channel. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our stories. Here, we bring you the most captivating tales, hidden histories, and unforgettable events. Stay with us, because today's story is one you won't want to miss. New York had always been a city that pretended to forget the things it couldn't stomach in daylight, but the truth was that its darkest machinery never slept. Frank Costello understood that better than every politician whose hand he shook and every rival who doubted his patience. He was a quiet storm in a world that only recognized thunder, a man who built an empire not by barking orders or flaunting brutality, but by slipping into the spaces where the city's bones were weakest. He didn't look like the kind of man whose decisions could shape economies, decide elections, or send grown men into hiding, but the truth was carved behind his calm stare. A mind that never stopped calculating and a will that never bent. His power grew not from the barrel of a gun but from the slow, unseen tightening of influence that spread through judges, district leaders, police captains, union heads, and anyone foolish enough to believe they were immune to corruption. He dealt in favors, in debts, in whispered agreements made in back rooms thick with smoke. Violence was a tool, real, present, always available, but never his first move. That made him more dangerous than the ones who used it carelessly. The city knew his name even when it pretended not to. He had come from nothing, a boy from Calabria dragged across the Atlantic to the tenements of East Harlem. Poverty was its own kind of teacher, and it taught fast. He learned early that the only people who got ahead were the ones willing to step across lines others were afraid to approach. As a teenager, he ran with the street gangs that prowled Manhattan's underbelly, and by the time Prohibition hit, had already carved out a lane where he could thrive. Liquor was the blood of the city, and he made sure it flowed. He partnered with men who had sharper tempers and louder reputations, but everyone understood the same unspoken truth. Costello was the brains that made their muscle matter. When other bootleggers were killing each other over turf, Costello was buying protection, bribing officials, investing in legitimate businesses that washed away the stench of criminal enterprise. He knew the future belonged to men who could walk in both worlds. By the 1930s, he was no longer merely a figure in the shadows. He was the shadow. From the Copacabana to City Hall, his reach wrapped around New York like a velvet noose. He built alliances with men who controlled entire boroughs with a handshake, men whose influence could turn an unknown candidate into a mayor. People feared him not because he threatened them, but because he didn't need to. His calmness was unnerving. His silence was a verdict. His politeness felt like finality. He could look at a man, listen to him speak for 2 minutes, and already know whether that man would be useful, dangerous, or gone. The police knew he existed. The FBI knew he existed. Even Washington flinched when his name came up behind closed doors. But they could never make anything stick. Not really. He was protected by the sheer size of the web head built. If you tugged at one thread, 10 more tightened around you. Costello left no fingerprints on the things that mattered. He didn't threaten witnesses, he made sure witnesses had no reason to speak. He didn't fight with rival mobs, he turned rival mobs into business partners. He didn't need to kill judges, he bought their loyalty years before they reached the bench. But every empire, even the quiet ones, casts a long shadow, and shadows always attract enemies. One of them was Vito Genovese, a man who believed that power belonged to whoever was willing to use the most force. Genovese saw Costello's elegance as weakness, his restraint as hesitation. He envied the respect Costello earned from politicians and other crime families, and he despised the fact that Costello didn't fear him. In truth, Costello didn't fear anything except losing the order he had built. The underworld was barbaric by nature, but had tamed it into something profitable, predictable, manageable. Genovese wanted chaos because chaos made men like him important. It was inevitable that they would collide. The city around them was changing. Post-war boom, new politicians, new police commissioners, the government tightening its grip on organized crime. Costello had survived decades of shifting tides, but his enemies saw opportunity in the noise. They sensed he was aging, that his patience was thinning, that the spotlight of public attention was growing dangerous. They mistook calculation for vulnerability. In 1957, a man named Vincent Gigante stepped out of the shadows and fired at Costello in the lobby of his apartment building. The bullet grazed his head, sending him collapsing to the ground while his blood smeared across marble flooring that had never expected such a scene. It was the closest anyone had ever come to tearing down the man who never raised his voice. As Costello lay there, half conscious, the world around him fractured for the first time. He survived, but the message was unmistakable. His enemies were done waiting for the old world to shift. They were going to force it. Yet even in that moment, as doctors murmured and detectives whispered, Costello refused to cooperate. Nothing to say, he managed, the words steady despite the ringing in his skull. He lived by a code that had become almost ancient in a world growing hungrier, louder, more reckless. Loyalty, discipline, silence. But the attack changed everything. It didn't break him. It unmasked the reality he'd always known. Power never stayed still. It grew or it rotted. And his was now a battlefield. The city felt the tremor. Politicians tightened their ties nervously. Rackets began shifting allegiances. Gangsters whispered in dim bars, wondering whether the era of Frank Costello was ending or whether the man would rise again, colder and more unforgiving than before. Costello withdrew from the public eye, but withdrawal wasn't surrender. It was calculation. He could feel New York adjusting, recalibrating around him. He watched as men he had raised tried to chart their own paths, as rivals scrambled to claim pieces of a kingdom they had never truly understood. Influence didn't vanish just because a man stepped into the shadows. It lingered, binding the city to the memory of his decisions. He still had friends in the courts, in the unions, in the police stations where rookies learned early that certain names required special care. His empire was quieter now, slower, but not gone. Just different. He spent his final years not as a relic, but as a ghost the city could never fully shake. Even those who hated him knew that without his subtle hand, New York would have been a far bloodier place. He had built something monstrous, yes, but it was a monster with rules. Without him, the rules began to break. The city changed again. New gangs, new vices, new wars fought by men who didn't know what restraint meant. Costello watched from a distance, knowing the truth that his enemies never understood. Power wasn't about brutality. It was about control. And control was something few men in history ever mastered the way he had. When he died in 1973, there were no public celebrations. No relief. No triumphant declarations that an era had ended. The city simply absorbed the news like it absorbed everything else, quietly, uneasily, as if acknowledging that a fundamental piece of its architecture had shifted. In back rooms across Manhattan, old-timers raised glasses, not in sorrow, but in recognition. Whether they loved him or despised him, they all understood the same truth. New York would never see another Frank Costello. His legacy wasn't written in gunfire or headlines. It was written in the way the city learned to operate, in the silence between political deals, in the subtle machinery of influence that outlived him by decades. He had shaped a world that pretended it didn't know his name. And even after death, the city continued to whisper it anyway. The bullet that grazed Frank Costello's skull didn't just tear skin, it tore open a citywide scramble for control. While he healed behind guarded doors in the hospital suite that smelled of antiseptic and tension, New York convulsed. Men who had once whispered his name with careful respect now spoke it with fear, or worse, with opportunity. The attack wasn't simply a hit, it was a declaration that the old order was cracking. Costello lay in bed drifting in and out of consciousness, the rhythmic beeping of machines barely masking the low murmurs of detectives outside the door. He could hear the uncertainty in their voices, the way they wondered how a man so untouchable had suddenly been dragged back into mortal territory. But mortality didn't frighten him. What frightened him, though he'd never admit it, was chaos. For decades he had kept the underworld steady, balanced on a knife's edge but controlled. Now that edge trembled. Outside the hospital's walls, Genovese moved like a predator through the city, gathering men, tightening alliances, promising power in a voice that mixed venom with ambition. He believed Costello was finished. He believed the kingdom was his for the taking. But what he didn't understand was that Costello's power had never been built on fear of violence. It had been built on trust, on investments paid over decades, on relationships so deeply woven into the city's core that even rivals hesitated before making a move. That network didn't dissolve just because one man pulled a trigger. While Costello recovered, the men who owed him favors, senators, ward bosses, police captains, felt a sudden chill. They knew if he fell, the city would tear itself apart in a wave of desperate power grabs, each more reckless than the last. They had enjoyed stability under him, even if they'd never admit it publicly. Stability meant predictability, and predictability meant profit. The weeks after the shooting were marked by a strange silence across Manhattan's criminal districts. No one knew whether Costello would return or retreat. Some said he was finished, that the bullet had done more damage than the newspapers claimed. Others said he would return stronger, colder, ready to unleash a quiet reckoning that would reshape the city once more. But Costello himself knew the truth. Survival meant knowing when to step back. Not out of fear, but out of calculation. When he finally left the hospital and stepped into the early morning air, cool, sharp, uncomfortably clean, he felt the city staring at him, waiting. He didn't give it an answer. He went home, closed the door, and vanished from public life. But retreat wasn't surrender. Not for a man like him. He began to pull back his involvement, piece by piece, giving the illusion that he was yielding power while in reality securing the positions of men he trusted. That was how he always operated, subtlety so deep that most never recognized it as strategy. He attended fewer meetings. He distanced himself from the nightly gatherings where the city's movers and shakers traded secrets like currency. He let Genovese believe he had won. And the city bought the illusion. Newspapers wrote that Costello was aging out of relevance, that he was stepping aside. Detectives told themselves that justice had finally pushed him into a corner. Politicians whispered that his influence was fading. But the truth was much quieter. Costello had decided that visibility had become a liability, and invisibility was his new weapon. Still, power doesn't slip away cleanly. It leaves traces, tensions, fractures. The men who once depended on him began drifting, unsure where loyalty now belonged. Some aligned with Genovese, attracted by his show of force. Others tried to remain neutral, hoping the storm would pass. But neutrality was the most dangerous choice in times like these. With Costello's withdrawal, the streets grew more unpredictable. Younger gangsters, raised in violence rather than subtlety, saw opportunity in every shadow. They didn't understand diplomacy. They didn't respect the old rules. They believed the underworld was a playground waiting for new kings to rise. Costello watched all of this from afar. He spent his days in his apartment, reading newspapers with a quiet frown, listening to the shifting patterns of the city like a veteran soldier hearing distant gunfire. He knew what would come next. The city was unraveling exactly the way he had feared. And though Head stepped back, he still felt every tremor as if it ran through his own body. In political circles, men whispered that they missed his steady hand. No one said it publicly, no one ever would, but behind closed doors they admitted that the streets had been calmer when Costello's invisible presence guided things. It was an uncomfortable truth. The man they had spent decades trying to expose had been the one holding back the worst chaos. Costello knew that too. He had created a system that could survive only as long as he remained part of it. Without him, the predators were circling each other, hungry and impatient. One night, alone in the dim glow of his living room, the city humming beneath his window, Costello realized something that settled heavy on him. Stepping back had preserved his life, but it had doomed the world he built. And there was nothing more ruthless than watching the things you crafted fall into hands that would never value them. He didn't return to the criminal world, not in the way he once had. But he didn't let go of his influence either. He became a ghost woven into the city's fabric, silent, unseen, but always present. Politicians still owed him favors. Judges still hesitated when his name echoed in their memory. Old alliances still held, quietly, stubbornly. But the new order, driven by ambition and greed, had no patience for ghosts. They wanted territory, money, dominion. They wanted everything Costello had built without understanding the cost of maintaining it. Costello spent those years in a strange limbo, not defeated, not victorious, simply waiting. And the city, restless and hungry, devoured itself in slow degrees. He watched it all, knowing that his absence was a wound the underworld couldn't stop bleeding from. Knowing that he had shaped an era, and that era was ending not with gunfire, but with erosion. In his silence, he carried the heaviest truth of all. The empire he had forged through caution, restraint, and intelligence would be remembered only in fragments, whispered in stories told by men who weren't even born when his word could move the entire city. And still, long after he had stepped away, New York continued to move according to patterns he had set. Because real power, true, quiet, unshakable power, never collapses in a single moment. Costello knew that. And the city, deep down, did too. Years passed, and New York did not stop changing. The skyline rose higher, swallowing older neighborhoods in glass and steel. The streets, once mapped and patrolled with a careful hand, became a playground for a new generation. Young men and women who had no memory of the city's previous order, who saw caution as weakness, patience as anachronism, and restraint as irrelevant. They laughed at the old rules, convinced that only the loud, the violent, and the impatient could claim dominion. But Costello watched them, always watching, with a quiet bitterness that never left him. He saw how the delicate system he had spent decades constructing, built on loyalty, trust, favors, and unspoken agreements, was unraveling, thread by thread, consumed by chaos the way unchecked fire devours dry timber. Old allies, men who had once moved mountains at his command, now came to him not for guidance but for counsel. They walked into his apartment with measured steps, aware that the man who had once commanded the city with a glance now operated as a ghost, a shadow behind the curtains, observing but not acting. They spoke cautiously, testing the waters, knowing that Costello's silence carried as much weight as any decree once issued from the tables of the Copacabana or the smoke-thick back rooms of union halls. They wanted him to see the chaos, to weigh in, to remind them what it meant to operate with precision. But Costello rarely spoke. When he did, it was with the soft authority of someone who had seen empires rise and crumble while the world assumed they were invincible. He walked the city infrequently, but always in a way that reminded those who remembered. The city could never fully exist without his fingerprints somewhere in its machinery. He rode in unmarked cars, kept to streets he once navigated like a chessboard, listening, noting, cataloguing. The new gangs, the young enforcers, moved like wildfire through neighborhoods he had once controlled with subtle pressure, but they lacked awareness. They acted on impulse, and their impulsive victories came at a cost. Property destroyed, alliances fractured, innocence caught in crossfire. In Costello's mind, every misstep was a lesson in the violence of ignorance, a confirmation of why restraint had always been the most dangerous weapon in a man's arsenal. Politicians felt his presence even if they never saw it. Ward bosses who had once feared to defy him now whispered nervously behind closed doors, unsure whether to align with Genovese heirs or to seek out the fading threads of Costello's network. Judges hesitated in rulings, unions faltered under mismanagement, and law enforcement agencies, frustrated by their inability to fully control the street, found themselves pawns in games they barely comprehended. Costello's influence persisted not because he wielded power, but because he had made it habitual, woven into the routines of the city so deeply that removing him left an invisible vacuum, felt by everyone, even the unaware. He did not intervene directly, not anymore. Intervention was dangerous, too visible, too prone to creating martyrs in a world that no longer respected subtleties. Instead, he adjusted quietly, nudging outcomes with phone calls that seemed innocuous, with favors remembered and repaid in silence, with relationships that acted as invisible brakes on the most reckless ambitions. He measured every ripple, every tremor, ensuring that when things collapsed, they did so in ways that left him free, untouchable, and unrecognized. Despite his withdrawal, chaos crept through the city. Younger criminals saw only openings, not the consequences of filling them. Territories that had been governed by tacit agreements descended into violent competitions. Bars and warehouses burned. Men who had not learned discretion rushed forward with bluster and firepower, thinking that strength alone would secure loyalty. Costello watched these developments like a surgeon observing tissue deteriorate under neglect, his mind cataloguing every misstep, every fracture, every opportunity for learning, or for disaster. Every so often, a familiar name would surface, a reminder that his era had once held sway. A former lieutenant now struggling to maintain control over a neighborhood, a union head under pressure from new operators, a corrupt cop whose careful balance of favors was failing under scrutiny. They all came to him indirectly, through back channels or trusted intermediaries, seeking answers, seeking advice, or simply seeking confirmation that the man they feared and revered still existed. And Costello, ever the strategist, allowed them to reach conclusions on their own. He rarely corrected misjudgments outright. He merely provided a seed, a whisper, a subtle pressure that guided outcomes without ever being recognized as guidance.